Good evening, and welcome to our final Beyond the Walls public lecture series for 2021. It is really lovely to be here with you, and on behalf of the Faculty of Social Science and Humanities at Ontario Tech and Oshawa Public Libraries, I would like to thank you for joining us. My name's Jennifer Gardner, and I'm the Manager of Community Engagement and Programming at Oshawa Public Library. And together with my colleagues, Jennifer Clark and Karen Douglas, it is my pleasure to welcome you this evening. The Beyond the Walls collaboration launched in June 2020, and tonight we are proud to announce this is our 20th event. I'd like to thank, I'd like to thank Andrea Braithwaite, who couldn't be here with us tonight. Andrea has been awesome in organizing our guest speakers and moderating the discussions. Our sincere appreciation to all of you who have supported this collaboration by either guest lecturing, attending the programs, or by talking it up amongst your networks. Thank you so much for your continued support. I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. The land we are standing on today is the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nation and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We acknowledge that Oshawa is covered under the Williams Treaties, and as a settler on these lands, we are all treaty people. May we respectfully honor the knowledge and understanding of the Indigenous stewards of these ancestral lands and ensure that the voices of the First Peoples are represented in our collections, programs, and services. We encourage everyone with us tonight to become aware of the treaty relationships and traditional territories you are situated on, wherever you may be located. And we invite you to put that in the chat if you'd like. During our presentation, we kindly ask for you to keep your mics muted. And if you have any questions, you could either put them in the chat or feel free to ask them once we open up the discussion period. Tonight's event is being recorded and will be available in a few days on both the faculty and the library's website. There will be a link to a short survey added in the chat. We encourage you to fill it out and provide us with any feedback on tonight's discussion or on any of the other past Beyond the Walls lectures. Now I'd like to introduce to you our esteemed guest lecturer, Professor Amanda Robinson, who is an academic associate in the Faculty of Social Science and Humanities. Her research explores the role of visual culture in mediating technological change in Oshawa, Ontario during the Industrial Revolution. Amanda, welcome.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for that wonderful introduction and for inviting me here again to present my research on advertising in Oshawa around the turn of the 20th century. Some of this content was developed as part of my graduate research, but it also has been something that's interested me as someone working in Oshawa's public heritage institutions. So I had the pleasure of working as a tour guide at Parkwood Estate for over 10 years, where I was able to work with the collections there. And that's where a lot of these images come from. So if you'll just bear with me here while I get my screen share going, I can share those with you. So I'm talking about advertising in the age of industrialization. Advertising as a site of mediating technological change, which was messy and uneven and didn't always deliver on the promises that it presented itself with to consumers, citizens, and people who were living through that change. So advertising has been called a magic system by the esteemed scholar and historian Raymond Williams, who looks at advertising as a site of mediating technological and cultural change during a period of rapid economic change. So advertising, as I'm sure you're aware, sells a vision of the good life. It's not always an accurate depiction of reality, as you may know. And when we talk about industrialization and the rate of change, it's important to consider that there was a simultaneous revolution in print culture during the early 20th century. This brought color print to people's living rooms and lives. And it also presented change in digestible ways amid this rapid technological shift that came with the Industrial Revolution. So we'll look at visions of economic change as it unfolded alongside technological change. We'll talk a little bit about the ways in which a specific case study of advertising, that is the McLaughlin Carriage and Motor Car Company, presented technological change with rose-colored glasses, that is through a sort of optimist lens. For reasons that were connected to their ability to sell a very modern invention, which was the automobile, but also buffer some of the the feedback that they were getting about this type of change and what it brought for people on the ground in their day-to-day lives. And we'll also look at that in the context of technological imperialism, rather, the fact that Canada emerged as an offshoot of empire, really. So the ways in which the McLaughlins continued to use imperialistic frames to present their products, their carriages and their automobiles, but also the ways that they adapted to the reality of nation building in the last half of the 19th century and then moving into the 20th century, a truly modern era. So I recognize some of the names in the room here today, and I know that some of you are already familiar with McLaughlin Carriage Company and Motor Car Company. If you're from Oshawa, as I often hear from people when I deliver parts of this presentation or pieces of it, that they have someone who worked at General Motors. Pardon me. You all got to see my puppy at the start of this presentation, and I apologize if you're also hearing him in the background. So the McLaughlin Carriage Company really benefited from the nation building that was happening in Canada in the last few decades of the 19th century. They benefited from the economic policies of the national policy. They also were able to make use of the nationwide railway that was part of that nation building process in the last decades of the 19th and early 20th century. So as they were building their carriage empire, they were also adapting to new forms of print culture and getting their advertisements out there for people to see. And they became more sophisticated as time went on. In the 1860s, which is when Robert McLaughlin started to make carriages and cutters in Enniskillen and then developed a shop here in Oshawa in the 1870s. The advertisements were simple, but they had some really interesting and important hallmarks of the move towards a more progressive and modern style of advertising. So they began to, use their place name, Oshawa, after they set up shop here in Oshawa. And then they also added watermarks and more information to their advertisements. On the right, you can see an early ad for McLaughlin Electric, which was one of their first prototype automobiles. And this was also offering a bit more textual information. The visuals are simple. The automobile and the carriage just sort of exist outside of the context of any social or cultural world. There's no landscape around them, as you can see. And it really was an old style presentation of their product. Didn't really exist within the context of a social world. And it really sidestepped any of the realities of the time. And that was that Canadian roads were very much impassable. Seasonal weather flows played havoc, of course, with the environment. And the reality was that Oshawa wasn't very well suited to automobiles. So these are images just after the turn of the 20th century, 1922 and 1915. After the McLaughlins had already abandoned their carriage making, because they stopped doing that in 1915, realizing that, in fact, the way to go was the automobile. And they increasingly began to make their advertisements more complex and sophisticated to tell their brand story, essentially. So they built a brand around the durability of their craftsmanship, but also they kept one foot in empire as they looked forward towards what it meant to be a Canadian business, and really also tried to harness that rhetoric of Canadian policy and Canadian nationalism, quite frankly. So they begin to include color on their automobile and carriage covers. Of course, this comes right before the turn of the 20th century. They're relying on new mediums of print. Lithograph color becomes accessible to them and they start to use that. I'm sorry if my my window here is maybe blocking the image. I'll move that over, my thumbnail. But you can see here on the right, their carriage catalog cover rather from 1899, where they are also outlining that they've grown. So in 1896, they're able to open several branch houses across the country. One of the brothers, George McLaughlin, who was kind of the lesser known of the two automobile brothers, Sam McLaughlin being his younger brother, who is the sort of renowned Colonel Sam fame of Parkwood, of the sort of McLaughlin name. He was, of course, the president of General Motors Canada and vice president of General Motors International when there was an amalgamation, or essentially when General Motors, pardon me, bought out the McLaughlin Motor Car Company in 1918. Carriage production had ceased, but by this time there was quite a bit of interest in growing that automobile base in Oshawa. But before there was the automobile, there was the carriage, and that's often overlooked, that the McLaughlins were quite successful, marketing their carriages, expanding their branch and service network across the country, and really thinking about positioning their goods as a Canadian product. This was happening even before real Canadian identity emerged in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. So you can see they're beginning to advertise what the factory looks like. This is Oshawa here in 1899, what their job capacity was, and really that Oshawa was kind of the center of their production capacity. This is the cover of their 1901 catalog. And what I love between these two is you really see that big leap from 1894 to 1899 to a much more visually evocative visual presentation. You can see they're still using the Imperial Allegiance, largest carriage factory under the British flag in 1901 after the turn of the century. And they're also showing their factory in context. They don't shy away from celebrating the industrial nature of the factory and picturing or placing that at the forefront of the town. And they're also showing a sort of dynamic transportation landscape that's existing within the context of the factory, with trains, with carriages, so on and so forth. So in some ways, there's some distinct modern elements to this. In others, there's a sort of throwback to perhaps a more 19th century ethos or ethic in their visual culture. But they really were in some ways replicating what was available to them with photography and what the factory looked like, you know, in this early example of visual culture. Disaster strikes. Their modern factory, as they so proudly advertise, the 20th century factory, you know, full feet or both feet fully in the 20th century or their modern era, is burned down one night in 1899. What's horrifying about this, of course, is that many people are at risk of losing their job. Of course, they're employing quite a few people. They grew exponentially in the years in the 1880s and 1890s in terms of their capacity of employment and also the number of vehicles that they produced. So this, you know, became quite a hit to Oshawa and its burgeoning industrial economy at this time. But ever the public man, Robert McLaughlin was able to turn this into a really promising public relations opportunity. And of course, that's one of the other really key pieces of this. Not only is their ability to leverage the visual realm to meet the needs of their growing business, but also use public relations as a tool in their capitalistic toolbox, if you will. So the day after the fire, Robert McLaughlin famously wrote a letter in the Oshawa Vindicator, which was a newspaper of the time, that basically this will not stop us. We will rise from the ashes and we will come back. And they do this. And so they even take the opportunity to use their visual culture as sort of a storytelling mechanism, right? You know, we will come back. And so they depict this on the back cover of their 1901 catalog as a sort of foreshadowing of what's to come in the next 10, 20 years. of their economic growth, which of course, as we know, they transition into automobiles not long after this, 1908. So only 6-7 years later, they move on. Our nameplate, time tested and fire tested, still remains the symbol of one grade only, and that the best. So some of the other things that they're also doing is leveraging, in addition to leveraging color, they're drawing in emergent ideas about the Canadian landscape during this period to market their carriages, even before they make that full-scale transition to automobiles. Pardon me. So some of these images from their sleigh catalog are really quite fun, and I wanted to integrate them into this presentation. I haven't shared them before, but they use obviously red, a very evocative Canadian color that we may recognize now as part of, branding the nation, branding national identity, of course, the maple leaf. Although prior to this, it wasn't as, there wasn't a widespread recognition that this was distinctly Canadian. But they do start to really appropriate the Canadian landscape, if you will, to market their sleighs. And this is like really in keeping with the cultural milieu that Robert McLaughlin and his family were moving through the world in. Of course, they were, Robert McLaughlin Sr. was sort of an upstart, a family man, very well known for his work ethic and loyalty. And it was really his sons, Samuel and George McLaughlin, who were able to leverage their father's credibility as an industrialist, as that sort of consummate Victorian businessman, and really parlay that into the credibility that would help them grow their capacity as industrialists and capitalists. And with that came access to an upper class cultural milieu that had connections to royalty, incredibly close imperial connections, where at their home, featured here on the right, Parkwood Estate in Oshawa, they did entertain royalty, dukes, duchesses, so on and so forth. And they were also part of a larger North American sort of upper crust culture that enabled them to not only travel, but also take part in, quintessential Canadian pastimes, hunting, fishing. Sam McLaughlin was known as that sort of, wilderness man, if you will. And in that, they also forged a visual culture that drew on those types of activities. And so this is a dog sled team pictured at Parkwood Estate from the 1930s, in keeping with sort of those outdoor winter activities that they were known so well for. I mean, even the estate itself had stables for horses. Samuel McLaughlin was known for taking fishing and hunting trips, and it really was part of also how they fashioned the visual culture that they were presenting to consumers. So the other thing that they were doing just after the turn of the 20th century with that new factory that was built, pardon me, I jumped ahead, was modernizing their industrial processes and moving further away from a craftsman artisan style method of production to a factory line system, which presented opportunity for how much they could do, how many cars they could produce, of course, but also changed the nature of work that workers were doing on the factory floor, and really reconfigured the relationship between management and workers. And of course, the offshoot or byproduct of that is the eventual formation of the labor movement in Oshawa and a movement towards unionization in the late 1930s. But in those first 30, 35 years of the 20th century, the way that the McLaughlins packaged their product and also managed their workforce was really around trying to bring people under the banner of technological imperialism. We are producing items in a 20th century factory in the name of empire, right? And then in the name of nation, we sort of see that transition. And then they also are able to, or sort of forcefully begin to leverage Canadian nation building as part of this message. So through public relations, they present this very optimistic view of what it will mean to adapt modern style factories, modern style transportation, like automobiles. And they do so through several different public relations steps. In addition to managing their workforce through celebration, through parades, through picnics, through employee recognition and loyalty, they also undertake an effort to map Canada with the automobile. So this was the first auto trip across the prairies, and it was a trip that George McLaughlin took in 1911 across the prairies with several other people who were part of the, sorry if that is obscuring it, who are part of the sort of livery auto trade in Oshawa at the time. But they also hired an Indigenous man to be their guide and took the McLaughlin Buick around to different stops along a coast-to-coast trip. So from Ontario all the way out to British Columbia, stopping at critical juncture points and really positioning the car in sort of Canadian landscapes, right? Like a prairie field or among a group of Indigenous people as sort of like, this car is a truly Canadian car. It's sort of claiming space for the McLaughlin automobile across the country. The other thing that I came across as I was looking for just sort of seasonal based things was this Christmas card. I talked a little bit about the cultural milieu that the McLaughlins existed and moved through the world in. They had connections to the British monarchy. They welcomed royalty, as I mentioned, to Parkwood Estate. And they also received Christmas cards from Buckingham Palace. And the archive collection at Parkwood has a whole range of Christmas cards that the McLaughlins sent out, but also received. And this one from 1941 really stuck out to me, in large part because it was from Buckingham Palace, but also because it depicts, some of those public relations advertisements that I mentioned on my previous slide, depicts the relationship between colonizers, if you will, and Indigenous peoples. And you see here, there's no inscription to tell us, what this Christmas card is supposed to represent, but certainly the visual cues represent Indigenous peoples in a monolithic and sort of, maybe stoic or very constrained way, amid a sort of celebration of Christmas, in the colonies, quite frankly. So it's sort of like, a throwback to that colonial past, something which continuously popped up in the McLaughlin advertising, as did cultural appropriation of Indigenous history, knowledge, and culture. So these are things that are certainly, it's important for us to acknowledge and look at, pardon me. The other thing that they did, I mentioned the management of their staff, of their employee base. This is a McLaughlin parade float. So one of the things the company did was have a sort of procession of all their different departments. They would walk through Oshawa and their parade at Prospect Park, which eventually will become Parkwood Estate, just north of the downtown. And in this way, they were also presenting technological optimism, a sort of forward thinking, embrace the new, but through the lens of the empire. You can see empire is still being used here as a sort of a key word in how the McLaughlins were positioning their advertising and their brand story and their brand narrative. Here we have the trimmers at Prospect Park. Of course, trimmers being an occupation at the time that was primarily occupied by women, although you would also have men working alongside women. Sometimes the roles would be parsed out based on their gender. But these were, pretty important large functions for the staff to attend every year. And they were often centered and situated around that celebration of imperialistic roots, but also company loyalty. And so I included a few of the old and the new here to set us up for some of the ways in which the McLaughlins continued to use optimism as a frame or lens to package cultural change. I'm so sorry for the background noise. I'm not sure how much of it's registering. So they were presenting the carriage. This is the austere Robert McLaughlin, the senior, the patriarch, who was known for really not loving cars. He was very skeptical and resistant to embrace automobiles, was, famously convinced by his sons, George and Sam, to really take up that mantle. And by that point was already closing in on retirement anyhow. But at the same function in 1913, which was the McLaughlin Parade, you sort of have the juxtaposition of the old technology and the new technology, of course, laden with that imperialistic flag signpost, right, situating it within the British Empire. And then you also start to see that showing up, or there's examples of it having shown up in their visual culture, where at first they're depicting the motor car, as something dangerous, messy, potentially disastrous. But eventually they pass the mantle, and their calendar images start to depict that shift from the car is not respectable to being something of respectability that the upper classes were using as part of their leisure culture. So the car goes to the future, right, and sort of passes the torch to the carriage, which heads to the past. They were also doing quite a bit with their testimonials during this period. So some of the other things they were doing was taking letters. They were soliciting letters from their clientele. Some of these letters really touch on the regionalism of Canada. So you have some from places like Quebec that are touching on, the roads and the winter conditions and how effectively their McLaughlin Buick handled in the snow or the sleet, or how certain features of those automobiles like wipers or windshields could really stand up the test of time and the threat or the peril of the weather that they were faced with. They were also seeking input in ways that in some ways confirmed what they were looking to say, I guess. So this is a contest that they put out. They sought input from farmers. They wanted to have farmers tell the McLaughlin Carriage Company why an automobile is profitable to a farmer. So you would enter the contest, and they asked, think of how it would keep the young folks on the farm, make farm life brighter, save money in your crop by fetching parts to repair machinery, carry stuff to market. And so then they took this, these testimonials, this contest, and of course, if you read the fine print, the prize was towards a new McLaughlin automobile. It wasn't really cash prizes, such as the nature of modern contests sometimes breed that fine print. But they were getting more sophisticated in their advertising. They realized that they needed to hear what their customers, their clientele were saying, and that potentially they could take those narratives and then sell them back or package them to the people that they were soliciting business from to begin with. So a bit of a self-serving prophecy, but they did that in a way that was really positioning the automobile and that technological change in the visual realm as something to be optimistic about. And although they represented this as something good, here's some of the byproducts from that promotional contest, where they were asking farmers to write in and say, why an automobile is profitable to a farmer. They were doing it in a way that was anti-modern in some respects. So although they were promising that the automobile or the truck, if you will, could bring you into the modern era, deliver you modern conveniences, they were also promising to maintain a specific way of life. So think about how, your kids won't move away to the city because they have a truck to go out on the weekend or a McLaughlin car to go out on the weekend. And there was this sense that through this technology, the old way of life could be preserved. So in that respect, despite using technology as a sign of optimism or a vessel of optimism, a vehicle for optimism, if you will, they were also using it as a way to promise that those monolithic family units would be preserved as is. And this is happening in 1916. They released these sort of two counterpoint promotional magazines or catalogs, if you will, on one hand promising farm life and freedom, and then on the other hand promising city life and liberty. As they're doing this, of course, World War I is raging. The women's movement is the first wave of the Canadian women's movement, and the women's movement more broadly is reaching a fever pitch with demands for votes for women, of course, happening within the context of World War I as well. And really, the world is changing in technologically catastrophic ways. Technology at this time, especially during World War I, sort of makes humans grow up, because there is these really stark visuals that are being captured in the trenches of Europe, and really giving people a bit of a jolt, right, within this context, although the McLaughlins are able to use visual culture to sort of paint over that and get rid of some of those messy parts of industrialization by presenting, this perfect life, if you will. But in keeping with some of the ways in which I touched on the appropriation of an Indigenous culture and the erasure of Indigenous peoples as well from these narratives and from these stories, because of course this is also a story about colonialism, right? And economic imperialism as well. They're also positioning this primarily as a middle class and white undertaking. You can see the vision of the city is the Great White Way here on the right. And throughout City Life and Liberty, there is really a nod to escaping the sights and smells of the city. One can take their private transportation and leave the industrial spaces of the city for fresh air, right? So it's framed in a specific way. And it really does get to that, that binary that was really prevalent during this time, which is, the city and the farm, right? The urban and the rural, in ways that, of course, didn't capture the complexity of society at the time. But it really was that magic system, as I mentioned at the top of the presentation, where those glossy veneers of advertising are placed over the sort of sooty and messy parts of industrial capitalism to sanitize it, quite frankly, for the modern consumer in a way that was quite effective. The McLaughlins, if anything, were amazing storytellers, very effective. They were able to tell and retell their story. In fact, parts of Sam McLaughlin's story and narrative were placed directly over the archetype of Robert McLaughlin's story and narrative. And there are similarities and overlaps in how that maintained itself for over 100 years, quite frankly, that archetype of the benevolent businessman. Who really were great persuaders and really good at public relations, right? And so that's also part of that. How did visual culture, advertising, and industrialization interact and connect with one another? So advertising really was a tool of capitalism for the McLaughlins to buffer those really catastrophic effects of industrialization, like environmental change, like the fact that many workers had to leave rural existence and move to cities in the early part of the 20th century to get jobs in industrial manufacturing. And so this is a sort of complex history, and I haven't had the opportunity in this talk to talk much about labor's reaction to that and how some of those messier parts of industrialization from a human perspective were mitigated by the efforts of the Canadian labor movement. And that's an important part of the story as well. But for me, I really encourage folks to check out some of the images in this talk, which several are featured from the Thomas Boakley collection at the Robert McLaughlin Gallery, as well as Parkwood Estate. And I think there may have even been one or two in there from the Oshawa Public Library's collection. Thank you so much. Love to open it up to any questions.
All right, thank you, Amanda, for that very interesting talk. We're going to open it up to any questions, and I'd like to invite Karen Douglas to moderate our discussion. Karen, if you'd like to turn on your video. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, or you can raise your hand as Eric has. That's wonderful. Okay, take it away, Karen.
Okay, Eric, if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself to ask your question, please do so. So thanks, Dr. Robinson, for your presentation. So I'm a student, and I've heard things about you, but I've never had you as a professor. So it was nice to actually hear you lecture for once. But I do have a question though about something I put in the chat. How the Canadianness that you're talking about regarding like the road trip photos kind of reminded me of the Tragically Hip. So I'm kind of wondering why advertising this these days, it feels so bland and like it doesn't feel special anymore. Like there's no, aesthetically pleasing advertising. Like it's just all stuff that you just gloss over because it's so boring. So is there anything like modern advertising can learn from?
Oh, Walter Benjamin would say we live in the age of mechanical reproduction, and that's actually the problem, is that there's nothing new anymore, right? It's interesting because I think that some of the more effective ads that I can think of contemporarily or recently are tech ads, right? Like I often think of Apple's capacity to draw on kind of like human emotion and connection, right? You see, there's one ad that I've used with my students before, and it's an overlay of Maya Angelou reading a poem called The Human Family over photos shot with an iPhone, right? And it's only like 35 or 40 seconds, but it's incredibly compelling. And it is because it's a story, right? And it's that we're unified, we're connected. But I think too, part of that is like the average person sees, I think it's somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 advertisements per day. So are we all advertised out, right? I mean, at this stage, when the McLaughlins were putting out those really evocative color ads, like that may have been the first color ad you had in your house, right? And so your attention was more attuned to it. It maybe wasn't something that was part of your everyday ephemera or print culture that you had access to. Most people had access to newspapers, but they were black and white, right? So adding that color element to it in the early part of the 20th century or the latter part of the 19th century was a real bang for their buck, right? And I think they quickly realized that they could capitalize on that. But for recent ads, I think we're kind of, we're immersed in consumer culture. We live in a world where even if I try and turn off my ads, I still get ghost ads, right? Or like, I think my TV's off, but it's still playing ads in the background that I can't get rid of. So like, maybe it's the ubiquity of it, Eric, that really advertisers struggle to get our attention. And I think your comments really speaks to that, right? We're distractible. We have so much competing for our eyeballs that you're primed to turn away. Really, I think that would be the sort of social psychologist view of it, that you already prepare yourself to look away, and maybe do that more, because I don't think it could hurt any of us to have less advertisements bombarding us in our day-to-day lives. Thanks for the great question.
Yes, thanks for the great question, Eric. If anyone else has any questions, you can raise your hand like Eric did, or drop it in the chat.
Well, while we wait for maybe another question, I do have just a nice little follow-up comment for you, Dr. Robinson. I was actually just thinking about some recent, I'll use air quote recent ads that I've experienced in the past, and a couple that stand out are like the Tim Hortons ads that constantly were having like the parents or like grandparents showing up at a hockey arena and just like sharing Tim Hortons coffee or Timbits with one another. The Sidney Crosby ads or the Gretzky ads, like those had like a bit of like that storytelling thing you were talking about. And then also the Molson Canadian I Am Canadian ad. Like that one is just, I learned about that in high school as a case study.
Oh my gosh, you're speaking my advertising and society course, Eric, because students look at like brand nationalism with the Molson Canadian commercials. There's Air Canada has a whole series of going home for the holidays ones that are really effective. And the brand stories the Tim Hortons ones are really effective. Although there are some scholars that say that they capitalize on sort of xenophobic fears. There's one in particular that deals with an Asian family. A boy looks back at his experience wanting to play hockey and that his dad would never come to the rink because, it was not part of his culture and he just didn't understand hockey. And then the sort of flash forward is that he's there, he was there all along, kind of hiding, from the sidelines, watching with his Tim Hortons coffee, right? And some of the academic perspectives on this argue that actually it's playing on Canadian xenophobic fears about, others, and that it in some ways explicitly relies on the idea of othering some people and then bringing them into the brand narrative through that nice toasty cup of Tim Hortons coffee, right? Which in some ways is problematic, but also incredibly effective because when I show those to my students, or even the I Am Canadian rant, which we watch and analyze, invariably there are some who always say like, but these are like so effective, like they really do tell that story. But then it also is like they use stereotypes quite heavily to tell the story. And, to what degree are stereotypes effective tools for storytelling? The farmer, farm life and freedom, right? But then also they don't capture the full range of people's experiences and really just boil down complex topics into a stereotype, right? That all fits in, especially I love that you identified that kind of brand nationalism, because it is, Eric, you think about brands that have even the word Canada in them. And there's some of the ways in which Canada is also advertised internationally to other parts of the world too. So it's fascinating.
I really wish I could just take that class with you then, because it sounds like we
It's called Advertising in Society. It's just run for it's wrapped up for the fall semester, but it typically runs in the fall, and it's a great course.
Sadly, I will be graduating this year, so.
Well, congratulations to you. Very well deserved, I'm sure.
Back and take it as an interest course. There you go.
There you go. There you go.
Take it as a what?
Interest course.
Oh.
Why not?
If we're ever back to in person at some point,
Yeah.
I plan on sticking around, so I might just be showing up to Ontario Tech anyway.
We would love that. That's great, Eric.
Yeah, we'll take it back. We'll take it back. All right. Well, thank you. Is anyone else have a question they'd like to drop in the chat or raise their hand for Amanda?
I can. Hi, hi, Karen.
Hi, Peter.
Hi. Sorry, I don't know if I'm coming through, and I'm kind of
We can hear you.
Good. Well, so I've had the pleasure of seeing this presentation before or something similar. So thanks, Amanda, again. It's gets better every time you do it, so it's wonderful. But I'm still struck by the transition in technology. That one of the stories certainly captures so well here. And when the main goal of the advertising seems to be assuaging the fears, right? That a new technology will displace people and cause disruption to the family structure and all these other issues that get raised. And it just strikes me that, we're in an age now when the transition to AI, which is what we're seeing take place, that is the new technology. It's already happening. And yes, you will get some advertisement that's really pro AI and look at this look at the metaverse, look what's coming. Okay, you're going to be amazed. But I think you're just as likely to see, certainly in popular film and fiction, negative depictions of what the consequences of that'll be. So I'm still sort of waiting for the onslaught, I guess, of advertising / propaganda that forces us into that AI world, and what that'll look like, and whether the communication industry and advertising marketing industry will take lessons, from this era of when the transition from the buggy to the to the motor vehicle. By the way, the electric vehicle, which we're finally starting to advertise again, we should have stuck with it all along. But I'm just, I'm wondering if you had any thoughts on that about, what's happening today and how this sort of plays out.
Yeah, I think there's a connection there to those posters that they were soliciting input from the farmer. In some ways, like now, are the ways in which our social networks have been tapped and mined for money, right? And the way that they're essentially social media companies through psychometrics, or the process of gathering our data, our cybernetic data, like our IP address, our browser preferences, all of these things that we may not necessarily think about every time we log on. They then take that and in some ways package and sell it back to us through the advertising apparatus. So that impulse to adaptive advertising and finding new ways to harvest and get consumers, I think, will just be a natural extension of some of the things that you talked about. And certainly, I think, dangerous and insidious, because most folks don't have an in-depth knowledge of what these processes look like, or how they might be placed at risk by having their information harvested and then potentially sold to third parties from Meta or Facebook or whatever it is. But yeah, I think that, ultimately, unless folks are educated about these processes, they're almost being set up to fall prey and victim to them ultimately. So, for AI, I think that I imagine and foresee a world where the advertisements continue to become more sophisticated and hidden, right? In the same way that we've seen in film industry, movies, right? Where you have, your product placements. And I was watching Superstore recently. I watched the final season, and I kept seeing, when you watch a few episodes consecutively, you really start to notice the placement of things in really deliberate ways, right? It's so ubiquitous, and you wouldn't notice it if it wasn't in quick succession. But with the new tools of AI, I mean, that integration is going to become even more seamless, I think. So folks don't even pick up that they've been advertised to. It's just already there, right? They're already primed for it. Scary times.
Thank you. And I think, Karen, you had a question, did you not? Yeah, Karen, go ahead.
Yes, hi, thank you. I was wondering the techniques, when we go back to McLaughlin, the method, the techniques, the referral to the empire, were they unique? Were they cutting edge in their advertising, or was it everybody doing it?
That's a great question, Karen. So no, they weren't unique. It was pretty, couching their brand within the context of Empire was something that was happening in other brands in the Canadian magazine advertisers subscription service that I looked at in terms of where their ads were. It's hard to get a comparative because the archives I've looked at were primarily McLaughlin archives. So in terms of like a compare contrast analysis, haven't quite done that, although it's a really great precursor to potentially some other research. But what they were doing that was interesting, and I didn't have it on this slide, and I thought about including it, but I was also feverishly trying to get rid of some slides because I thought I might go over, is in about 1916, they have an ad that has maple leafs that frame their automobile that's kind of driving through the Canadian landscape. And it's really kind of like the first fully in Canadian nationalism that I've seen in their ads. But they still continue to use empire and Canada's connection to that imperial economy or commonwealth in the first 40 years of the 20th century, really. So they never really ended it, but they were in kind of a weird space where they were drawing on American capital. So sorry. American capital and high finance. So they had a foot in both worlds, in empire and also in, American influence, but also Canadian national. So maybe three worlds. They had a foot in three worlds if they had 3 feet. But so they weren't doing anything that was particularly new in terms of imperialism. What they were doing was kind of carving out their own niche. And one thing that they did do that often General Motors is credited with is they were advertising to men of modest means, which is in like 1915, 16, which is kind of the GM thing, right? GM is often credited with developing an automobile for middle-class consumers that was affordable. The McLaughlins, prior to being bought out by GM in 1918, were already kind of signaling that this is affordable for the middle class. They weren't doing it in the same way that General Motors was, but they were kind of giving a nod to that, trying to widen their market. Because for the first part of their company's operations, which was like long, they were in operations from the 1860s, to 1900, like 35 years, right? Before the car was even really something people were considering. They had really marketed around craftsmanship and the artisan quality of their product. And they did that explicitly as imperial, right? So there was like a kind of a bit of a messy transition for them from moving from the British to kind of Canadian, but they were able to carve that out. And I didn't give it much credit, but they also, once they had a connection with General Motors, they started to leverage General Motors marketing and advertising. And you start to see that change as well around 1915, 16, 17, leading into the 1918 takeover. They were drawing on some of the American aesthetics and trends. And there are some comparisons of that in the collections I've looked at as well, where you distinctively see that American influence kind of come in and maybe bump out the sort of British influence a little bit. Again, in keeping with what was happening in the world, right? With World War I, and the Americans were really an economic powerhouse during that period, and really moving forward with innovation and modernism in a way that Britain wasn't. So Canada, the Canadian automakers kind of looked to the south, and then eventually integrated with them. As we know, that kind of story ended in that way as well. I always talk too much, Karen. I'm so sorry if that was.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
We love that about you, Amanda. So great answer and great question. And if anyone else has questions, please feel free, raise your hand or drop it in the chat.
I have a question. I guess, so General Motors has just reopened in Oshawa, and after a couple of very painful years of not being around. Amanda, do you think that any of the older advertising that, really kind of fosters that nostalgia, for our city, do you think that it would be of any benefit for the current General Motors Corporation to look at, these age-old advertising that, spoke to so many people and kind of fed on emotions? Do you think that there would be of any benefit to kind of reinvent any of these classics?
I love this question, and it's a complex answer, and it is in part because I was working at Parkwood Estate in 2008 when there was some significant financial schisms at General Motors in Oshawa. And for the time I worked at Parkwood, there was a relationship with corporate GM and Parkwood as an institution that was preserving the memory of RS McLaughlin, right, as that critical piece of GM in Oshawa, right? In the period after they bought out Oshawa McLaughlin Motor Car Company, GM was fully on board with the McLaughlin narrative. They did everything they could to help promote it and use it as kind of a narrative of sustainability for the brand, because it was recognizable. They already had the the company town buy-in, if you will. But they started to shed that. After about 2008, they weren't as interested in that buy-in. The connections, with that institution I mentioned, weren't quite as strong. The ask for the donations or whatever it is. It didn't seem that GM was as interested in maintaining those, I'll call them ancestral ties. That's a problematic statement, but they weren't really invested. And because when I worked at Parkwood, I had the privilege of working with a whole number of volunteers who many of which were retired management or, several secretaries from GM. And I have one that I worked with on several public walking tours who told me a really sad story about how they used to, at the GM headquarters in Oshawa, have a full display about Sam McLaughlin and the McLaughlin family. And one day they just decided to take it down. And with no explanation. And this is, going back probably to 2001 or 2002, but there was that maybe corporate decision to just move forward. And on that as well, General Motors hasn't been particularly generous with sharing any of their archives that they may have with respect to GM history in Oshawa with researchers, some of whom I know, myself having been someone who's tried to reach out and get access to their archives. So, without knowing what their mentality is, but only being able to take cues from some of their actions, quite frankly, I don't think that they are. Do I think it would be valuable though? I mean, yeah, I do, because people are incredibly nostalgic about the McLaughlin's history. And I think that it may be that they don't recognize the credibility in Ackerman and potential profit that could be made by acknowledging it and continuing to incorporate it, because it doesn't seem like it's been a priority as of late, although they have had other things on the go. So far be it for me to be too critical. But yeah, there hasn't been a great relationship with General Motors and researchers, especially those who are interested in getting some of those key archival pieces that may yield some really great information. But George McLaughlin's personal business funds are located at Queen's University, and they are a treasure trove of information if you're interested in learning a little bit about the corporate culture. When it shifted from McLaughlin to General Motors, it became hyper-centered around scientific management and production capacity. And there, in some ways, was that relationship that had been cultivated with the McLaughlin and their employees was in some ways dashed a bit. And George McLaughlin retired early, and some of his personal letters indicate that he was disillusioned with the corporate culture that came with the General Motors takeover.
Thank you for that.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we would have time for maybe one more quick question. If anyone has any more questions, or we can end it a minute early. Yes, it's been wonderful listening to you.
It's true. I was a moonlight tour guide at Parkwood. We did a 1-hour tour, and I was thinking I need to get back there because I need to freshen up on some of my key facts. But it was always great, and you get to see a living piece of history through other people's eyes all the time. And I'm constantly taking some of the things I learned there and applying it to my role at Ontario Tech. So it's really great.
Well, thank you. Well, if there's no other questions, we'll make that a wrap, I guess. And thank Amanda so much for taking time tonight to go through the history. Advertising, Oshawa, it was very, very interesting. And I did see, yes, Eric had asked if we're continuing with Beyond the Walls in the winter, and we are taking a bit of a hiatus for a few months, and we'll be probably getting back in the summer. We're kind of planning a summer school, we're calling it summer school. And so we're hoping to maybe do some in-person so that, since it will be outside, hopefully nice weather, we can, we'll try that. We'll change it up a bit, see what we can do. So thank you so much for coming out tonight. Jennifer Clark has dropped in the chat the videos of past events and links to the past events if you want to check those out. Thank you so much for coming to our last one for
Big shout out to the university. Thanks so much for the collaboration, Dr. Peter Stewart. We really appreciate your vision and your support with this, and all the faculty of social science and humanities. It's been a pleasure working with everyone. And thank you to all of you who've supported the lectures. Happy holidays, everyone. We wish you all the best for 2022, and we hope to see you again.
Yes, shout out to Oshawa Libraries and to Andrea Braithwaite, who is usually
Yes.
does this, and she's an amazing.
Yes. Thank you,
Got it.
everybody. Good night.
Thank
Happy
you.
holidays.
Right.
Take care.